There are two images. The image on the left is of a round porcelain flask decorated with a picture of a dragon. The image on the right is a porcelain saucer decorated with a picture of a bird surrounded by flowers and grass. Figure 2. One Chinese porcelain. This 18th century moon-shaped porcelain flask adorned with a dragon, left, and the glazed porcelain saucer, right, were both made in Jingdezhen, in southeastern China, a center of porcelain manufacturing that created many such beautiful objects for sale in China and elsewhere. Credit left. Modification of work Chinese flask by Walters Art Museum / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit right. Modification of work saucer with motifs celebrating prosperity, China by Asian Art Museum of San Francisco / Wikimedia Commons, CC01. 0. Chapter Outline. 2.1 India and International Connections. 2.2 The Malacca Sultanate. 2.3 Exchange in East Asia. The 16th century was a time of exploration and the beginning of global ocean trade. When European nations such as Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, England, and France were just setting out on voyages of exploration and beginning to forge maritime trade networks, a thriving ocean-going commerce was already being carried on in the Indian Ocean. From the coastal provinces of India to the Straits of Malacca and the ports of Southeast Asia, China, and Japan and back again, raw materials of great value and manufactured products of great beauty traveled, figure 2.1. Along with them went religious beliefs, philosophies, technological developments, and other cultural influences. A timeline shows important events from the era covered in this chapter. In 1400 CE, the Malacca Sultanate was founded. In 1443 CE, the Hangul alphabet was created. In 1494 CE, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas. In 1498 CE, Vasco da Gama sails to India. A portrait of da Gama is shown. In 1500 CE, Sikhism was founded. In 1526 CE, the Mughal Empire was founded. In 1549 CE, the Menara Qudus Mosque was built. An image of the mosque is shown. In 1582 CE, Akbar founded Din-i-Ilaha. An image of Akbar is shown. In 1600 CE, the Battle of Sekigahara was fought. An image of the battle is shown. In 1653 CE, the Taj Mahal was completed. An image of the Taj Mahal is shown. Figure 2.2 Timeline. Exchange in East Asia and the Indian Ocean. Credit 1498 CE. Modification of work Vasco da Gama by E. Benjamin Andrews, Scribner's Sons / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit 1549 CE. Modification of work Masjid Menara Qudus by PL09 Parion / Wikimedia Commons, CC010. Credit 1582 CE. Modification of work Jesuits at Akbar's Court by Chester Beatty / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit 1600 CE. Modification of work Sekigahara Kasan Bayabuzi by the City of Gifu Museum of History / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit 1653 CE. Modification of work Taj Mahal by David Castor / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. This locator map shows the world. Highlighted regions include northeastern Russia, India, China, Korea, and Japan. Figure 2.3 Locator map. Exchange in East Asia and the Indian Ocean. Credit. Modification of work World Map Blank Shorelines by Maciej Jaros / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to explain the roles of Babur and Akbar in the rise of the Mughal Empire. Describe the distinctive aspects of the Mughal Empire's hybrid culture. Analyze the effects of geography, conquest, and immigration on Gujarat's role in Indian Ocean trade networks. Discuss the rise of the Maratha Empire. Explain how internal conflicts in India contributed to the success of European colonization. At the center of world trade in the 16th century was India. especially the ports on its western coast, such as the cities in the Sultanate of Gujarat. Through these harbors came the wealth and the people of the Indian Ocean world, creating a society notable for its prosperity and diversity. The desire to control this wealth attracted both European explorers and Indian dynasties, such as the Mughals and Marathas, and eventually it brought them into conflict. The Mughal Empire. Zahir al-Din Muhammad Babur had always dreamed of founding a great empire. His father, the ruler of a small Central Asian state named Fergana in what is now Uzbekistan, was a descendant of the famous conqueror Timur. His mother came from the family of the Mongol leader Chinggis Khan. In 1494, at the age of 11, Babur became ruler of Fergana following his father's unexpected death, and he set himself the task of gaining control of all the lands that had once fallen to his illustrious ancestor Timur. In 1504, he made a bold move. Striking out across the Hindu Kush mountains accompanied only by his family and 200 fighting men, he conquered the city of Kabul in Afghanistan. In 1526, using tactics he had learned from the Persians, with whom he had allied in the past, including the use of artillery, Babur defeated the much larger army of the Delhi Sultanate, a Muslim state in northern India, and established the Mughal, the Persian pronunciation of Mongol, Empire. Despite his desire to become ruler of India and his fascination with his new land, Babur did not adopt Indian culture. Although he was intrigued by the subcontinent's animals, plants, and climate, he had little interest in its people or in the Hindu religion. He described the people of India as lacking both personal beauty and manners. He admired the land's wealth but strove to recreate for himself and his family a taste of his homeland by designing gardens in the Persian style. He remained firmly oriented towards Central Asia and maintained a post road and way stations connecting the Mughal capital of Agra to Kabul. When he died, he was interred at Agra, but to honor his wishes, his body was later taken home to Kabul for burial. Link to learning. The Baburnama Book of Babur is a 16th-century illustrated account of Emperor Babur's exploits. Among the illustrations in the Baburnama are pictures of his battles, travels, and life at court. When Babur died in 1530, his eldest son Humayun inherited Mughal India. Humayun's reign was not a successful one. After only 10 years, he was forced to flee after being defeated in battle by Sher Shah Suri, the ruler of the Indian state of Bihar. Humayun sought refuge at the court of the Safavid Shah Tahmasp in Persia, where he became deeply immersed in Persian culture. In 1555, he returned to India and won back his throne, but his victory was short-lived. Only a few months after retaking the Indian city of Delhi, Humayun died after tripping on a steep staircase. Humayun's 14-year-old son Akbar inherited the throne. Although he was illiterate, possibly because of severe dyslexia, Akbar became the greatest of the Mughal emperors. Unlike his father and grandfather, who had remained oriented towards Central Asia, Akbar embraced India. He actively sought to incorporate Indians, both Muslim and Hindu, into his kingdom. Although he was aggressive militarily and expanded the bounds of the Mughal Empire across the northern part of the subcontinent and into the central plains to the south, he allowed local rulers to retain control of their lands so long as they submitted to him. To consolidate his hold on India, Akbar married the sisters and daughters of local rulers, both Muslim and Hindu. He did not force his Hindu wives to convert to Islam, and their marriage ceremonies included both Hindu and Muslim elements. Akbar did, however, introduce to India an institution found elsewhere in the Muslim world. The women of the royal family were physically secluded in a harem. Women's separation from the men of the court did not mean they were not influential, and wives, mothers, and even nursemaids often played a role in important political decisions. Nevertheless, during Akbar's reign, efforts to remove women from public life also led to the disappearance of their names from official records, and the practice of segregating them spread from Mughal households to those of the Hindu ruling classes, who adopted the custom. Although Hindus were undoubtedly influenced by Mughal customs, Akbar made no effort to enforce conformity to Islamic customs or to impose the Muslim religion on his subjects. In 1568, he abolished the jizya, a tax imposed on non-Muslims. He allowed new Hindu temples to be built, which had previously been prohibited, and provided several of them with money to support their activities. Sharia, the legal code of Islam, was applied only to Muslims, and a Hindu law code governed Hindus. Both Hindus and Muslims were welcomed into the army and Akbar's administration. Akbar revolutionized his empire's bureaucratic apparatus. The realm was divided into provinces, and each province was assigned a governor, a chief judge, a military commander, and a financial administrator. Akbar appointed civil servants known as mansabdars. Promotion was based on effort. Acting in ways that displeased Akbar could result in demotion or transfer to a less desirable location. Each mansabdar was also responsible for recruiting cavalry to serve in the Mughal army. Akbar ordered his empire to be surveyed, and fields assessed to determine how much revenue they would yield. The mansabdars were then compensated for their labor with taxes collected on specific units of farmland. As they rose higher in rank, more land was assigned to them. These lands were also periodically reassigned, however, and upon a mansabdar's death, all his wealth reverted to Akbar. A mansabdar's son might be allowed to inherit his father's property, should the emperor choose. These policies ensured that those charged with administering the empire remained loyal to Akbar. Not only did Akbar marry Hindu women and welcome Hindus into his administration, but he also proved tolerant of other religions and their adherents. He erected a hall to serve as a venue for religious debate, figure 2-4. At first, only Muslim scholars took part, arguing matters of law and theology among themselves and answering questions Akbar posed. Soon, however, Akbar grew dissatisfied and came to regard some of their positions as too rigid. He then invited representatives of other religions to participate, including Portuguese Jesuit missionaries. Akbar found Christianity interesting, but he rejected the Jesuits' teachings regarding the divinity of Jesus and reportedly found their insistence on monogamous marriage amusing. Painting A shows Emperor Akbar seated under a red canopy surrounded by religious officials. Painting B is a cropped version of image A, which zooms in on Akbar and the religious officials sitting closest to him. Figure 2. 4. Emperor Akbar. In this miniature painting from 1605 A, Emperor Akbar, shown in detail seated beneath a red canopy B, listens to religious debates among members of many different faiths. The men in black attire are Portuguese Jesuits. Credit and B. Modification of work Jesuits at Akbar's Court by Chester Beatty /Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Akbar eventually abandoned all recognized religions, however, and created his own personal cult called Din-i-Ilahi, the divine faith. This religion combined elements of many different faiths, and Akbar assumed a prominent role at its center. In 1579, he issued a decree proclaiming that all religious questions were to be decided by him. He was regarded by adherents of his cult as the agent of God who, in his role as representative of the divine, was bound to tolerate all religions. Akbar ceased performing the obligatory 5 prayers that Muslims must intone every day and began to worship divine light. He also began the practice of appearing daily to his subjects on a balcony so they could view him, reminiscent of a Hindu practice in which worshippers receive blessings by viewing the image of a deity. All these changes greatly disturbed Muslims in Akbar's court. For the most part, however, India prospered under Akbar. His conquests left much of the subcontinent united and peaceful. Although illiterate himself, he amassed a large library of books in many languages, employed large numbers of translators and scholars, and established schools for both Muslims and Hindus. Domestic and international trade flourished. Gold and silver flowed into India in exchange for textiles, spices, and precious gems. Handicraft industries boomed, and merchants grew wealthy. The peasants were heavily taxed to pay for the empire's bureaucracy, but they were excused from paying in full in times of drought or other natural disasters. Among those who benefited from the prosperity of Akbar's reign were wealthy Mughal women, who reinvested in commerce the revenues derived from landed estates, gifts of the emperor and his predecessors to female relatives. They used the profits they earned to endow mosques, build shelters for travelers, support artists and poets, and fund charitable endeavors. They also used their wealth to give gifts to the emperor and court officials, one of the ways in which they attempted to influence the workings of the Mughal government. Akbar's successors could not equal his achievements. When he died in 1605, his son Jahangir assumed the throne. Jahangir wanted to outshine his father and employed a large studio of artists who portrayed him in countless images as superior to other rulers. The paintings produced in Jahangir's studio were influenced by European paintings, especially portraits, that were given to him by the English, with whom he had established a commercial relationship. Jahangir patronized Muslim scholars who had been scandalized by Akbar's religious policies. But like his father, he established an imperial cult, and devotees claimed Jahangir appeared to them in dreams and could heal them. Also like Akbar, he welcomed people of many religions at his court and married both Muslim and Hindu women. Like his grandfather Humayun, Jahangir often drank heavily, which took a toll on his health. As he weakened physically, he allowed his favorite wife Nur Jahan, a Persian Muslim, to assume significant power in his government. She took part in public rituals, engaged in diplomacy, and issued imperial edicts. She also helped Jahangir choose a son to succeed him and arranged a marriage between this son, Shah Jahan, and her niece, Figure 2-5. Painting A shows Emperor Jahangir relaxing in a garden with several other people. Painting B is a close-up of Jahangir from Painting A, which more clearly shows Jahangir as well as his wife and son nearby. Figure 2-5 Emperor Jahangir. In this painting from about 1640 to 1650, A. Emperor Jahangir, shown in detail with his head framed by a golden disc B, relaxes with his favorite wife Nur Jahan and his son Shah Jahan in a garden. Nur Jahan loved gardens and paid for many to be designed. Credit A and B. Modification of work, Jahangir and Prince Khurram entertained by Nur Jahan, by Smithsonian National Museum of Asian Art / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Following Jahangir's death, Shah Jahan assumed the throne in 1628. To impress his subjects and other rulers with his importance, he commissioned the building of the Peacock Throne, an elevated platform covered by a vault ornamented with gold, semi-precious stones, and peacock sculptures, and he embarked upon numerous building projects. The most beautiful of these was the Taj Mahal, a tomb erected in 1631 for Shah Jahan's favorite wife Mumtaz Mahal, who had died the previous year giving birth to their 14th child, Figure 2-6. The tomb, in the city of Agra, perfectly reflects the hybridized Indo-Islamic culture of the Mughal dynasty and is considered an exemplary work of Persianate architecture. It was built in a garden at one end of a reflecting pool and features a large dome surrounded by 4 freestanding minarets, towers from which the Muslim faithful are called to prayer. While tombs in that part of India were normally made of common materials such as sandstone, the Taj Mahal is covered in white marble in a style befitting the resting place of a Muslim holy man. It is embellished with semi-precious stones and bears verses in elegant calligraphy, chosen from the Quran by Shah Jahan himself. The Taj Mahal is in the center of the photograph. A mosque sits on either side of the Taj Mahal. The Yamuna River is visible in the foreground. Figure 2-6 The Taj Mahal. The Taj Mahal, an opulent royal tomb built in 1631, sits on the banks of the Yamuna River in Agra. On either side of it are sandstone mosques. Credit: Taj Mahal by David Castor / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. In 1648, Shah Jahan moved the capital of the Mughal Empire from Agra to Delhi, where he embarked on another massive building project, the Red Fort. Inside this red sandstone fortress, palaces and administrative buildings were constructed, many of white marble or stucco polished or adorned with glazed tiles to resemble marble. Canals and Persian water wheels supplied the city with water, and a sewage system carried it away. Perfumed water flowed in channels through the city. Within the city walls, officials erected grand houses of their own. Mosques and gardens were built, many paid for by wealthy Mughal women. These building projects, while they greatly enhanced the beauty of Agra and Delhi, drained the treasury and led to increases in the tax burden of India's peasants. The Sultanate of Gujarat. Despite their power, the Mughals never controlled all of India, and several areas remained relatively free of their dominance. In the 16th century, one such area, the Sultanate of Gujarat on the northwestern coast of India, was an important center of Indian Ocean trade. Gujarat was located on the Arabian Sea, close to Persia and the Arabian Peninsula, figure 2.7. From May through September, monsoon winds blew, and the resulting ocean currents pushed sailing ships from East Africa and Arabia in the direction of Gujarat and other spots on the western coast of India, such as the province of Kerala to the south. In the winter months, the monsoon winds and currents reversed, helping sailors return home. In the period between these changes brought by the monsoons, foreign sailors and merchants made their home on India's western coast, and thriving commercial hubs developed with a year-round population of both Indians and non-Indians. This map is a regional map showing India, China, the Arabian Sea, the Bay of Bengal, the South China Sea, and the Indian Ocean. The Sultanate of Gujarat is highlighted. Gujarat sits on the northwest coast of India on the Arabian Sea. Figure 2.7. The Sultanate of Gujarat. Gujarat is located on the northwestern coast of India. Close to the Arabian Peninsula and bordering the Arabian Sea, the Sultanate of Gujarat was a hub for Indian Ocean trade. Credit: Modification of work Banda C by Demi / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. In 1573, Emperor Akbar incorporated Gujarat into the Mughal Empire. Through its harbors moved the wealth of India, and the port cities of Surat and Combat were especially busy. Among the goods exported were fine cotton textiles purchased by buyers in East Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. In addition to warehouses and trading companies owned by Indians, Arabs, and Persians, the port cities contained rest houses for travelers, shops, and banking houses. In addition to being a commercial hub, Gujarat was a place of learning. Many Islamic scholars made it their home, and several cities had large mosques and religious schools, some of which were built with funds provided by Hindu rulers. Beyond the book. The port of Surat. Surat was a prosperous port on the coast of Gujarat, the region conquered by the Mughal Emperor Akbar in 1573. The 16th century painting presented here by court painter Farrukh Beg commemorates this event, showing Akbar seated on a black horse greeting the town's residents, figure 2.8. This painting is one of many such illustrations in the Akbarnama, Book of Akbar, a text written in Persian that was commissioned by Akbar to serve as the official chronicle of his reign. Painting A shows Emperor Akbar entering Gujarat with his entourage. Painting B is a close-up from Painting A, which more clearly shows an elephant. Figure 2.8. Emperor Akbar. This 16th century image, A, by Mughal court painter Farrukh Beg, was influenced by Persian artistic styles of the period. Emperor Akbar was a great lover of art and studied it himself. The elephant in the foreground B may have been included in deference to Akbar's desire for the images produced by his artists to include symbols of Mughal power. Credit and B. Modification of work, Farrukh Beg. Akbar's triumphal entry into Surat. Akbarnama, 1590-95, by Victoria and Albert Museum/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. In what ways does this image indicate that Surat was a wealthy community? Where can you see the influence of Islam? How is the ethnic diversity of the city's residents indicated? The populations of Gujarat's ports were diverse. Although most residents were Hindus, other religious communities were well represented. For the most part, these were trade diaspora communities, communities established by merchants from foreign lands who came to do business, but often settled and married into the local population. The most significant of the trade diaspora communities in Gujarat were those founded by Muslims. Some of their inhabitants were the descendants of merchants who had arrived from Persia or the Arabian Peninsula as early as the 8th century, or descendants of Hindu merchants who had converted to Islam to better do business with Arab and Persian merchants. Sharing the faith of their business partners helped build the trust necessary for transacting business in distant lands, ventures that might take many years to become profitable. Sufis, Islamic mystics, had arrived in India in the 11th century, and a substantial number of Muslims had Sufi ancestors. Yet other Muslims were descended from soldiers who had arrived in India in the armies of Central Asian or Afghan invaders from the 10th through the 13th centuries. There were also large numbers of Parsis in the cities of Gujarat. The Parsis were Zoroastrians, members of a religious sect that worshipped fire and whose ancestors had arrived in India from Persia in the 7th century. They may have fled Persia after the Islamic conquest for fear of religious persecution, or they may have settled in India before the conquest and never returned home. Also present in Gujarat were Jews and Nestorian Christians, who had split from the larger Christian church in the 5th century over an argument regarding whether Jesus was of one nature, divine, or two, one human and one divine. The Nestorian Christians had come primarily from Syria and Persia. A larger Christian community lived in Kerala. Gujarat also housed small communities of Indian Jains, followers of Jainism and Buddhists. The great religious and ethnic diversity of Gujarat contributed to its commercial success, because merchants there traded more easily with others of the same religion and ethnic background in other parts of the world. Arabs traded with Arabs and Persians with Persians. Jews in Gujarat maintained ties with Jewish communities elsewhere in India, North Africa, and the Middle East. The prominence of the Muslim merchant community in Gujarat was undoubtedly aided by the fact that the Mughal emperors were Muslim. By the middle of the 17th century, however, Mughal dominance in India was being threatened. The rise of the Maratha Empire. Aurangzeb I was the last of the exceptional Mughal rulers in India. In 1658, he seized control of the Mughal throne and set about attempting to conquer rulers of states on the Deccan Plateau in south-central India. He also led an Islamic revival in the Mughal domains. A pious man who frequently stopped in the midst of battle to perform the required daily prayers, Aurangzeb sought to eliminate all non-Islamic practices from his court. He refused to hunt, which had been a traditional pastime of Mughal rulers, and did not listen to music, although members of his court continued to do so. He eliminated the debates of scholars of different religions that his predecessors had sponsored, as well as other practices such as weighing himself against an equivalent amount of gold on the anniversaries of his birth and coronation, because he considered it an inappropriate display of excess. Aurangzeb patronized Muslim scholars and had them compile a collection of Islamic law written in the Persian language. A skilled commander in battle, Aurangzeb expanded the bounds of the Mughal state. However, he proved unable to easily incorporate non-Muslims into his empire. Although at times he gave money to Hindu temples as previous Mughal emperors had done, at other times he ordered the destruction of the temples of Hindus who resisted his rule. He also imposed a special tax on Hindu pilgrims and, eventually, a tax on all non-Muslims. Hindus who served in his administration did not have to pay this tax. Nevertheless, they often received less compensation than did Muslim administrators. Muslim immigrants to India were also favored over Indian-born Hindus for important positions in Aurangzeb's administration. In their own words, wifely devotion. One Hindu custom Aurangzeb I sought to stamp out was the practice of sati, or sati, the self-immolation of a Hindu widow following her husband's death. The practice seems to have arisen sometime after 500 CE and was practiced primarily by members of aristocratic Hindu warrior families, who might choose to burn themselves alive to honor their husbands or might be pressured to do so by the husband's family. Despite Aurangzeb's prohibition, sati continued among many pious Hindus. An excerpt from the autobiography of the 17th-century Hindu poet Bahina Bai demonstrates the extreme devotion a Hindu woman was to have for her husband. I want my thought concentrated on my husband. The supreme spiritual riches are to be attained through service to my husband. I shall reach the highest purpose of my life through my husband. If I have any other god but my husband, I shall have committed a sin. My husband is my means of salvation. Without a husband, one does not keep God in mind. Blessed is she who knows herself as a dutiful wife. She carries along at the same time her household duties and her religious duties. Such an one bears the heavens in her hands. She who in everything accepts her husband's wishes in a noble spirit, and though it might mean even death will not violate his command, blessed is she in this present world, blessed is her family. For her comes the summons to heaven. In body, speech, and mind she submits herself to her husband. Without inquiring the right or the wrong of it, she is willing to give her very life to fulfill his wish. She serves her husband as prescribed by religious rites, and is ever at his side like a slave. Bahina Bai, a translation of her autobiography in verses, translated by Justine E. Abbott. According to Bai, why should a woman obey her husband? What benefits does she derive from obedience? Why might a woman have been willing to engage in an act as extreme as sati? Aurangzeb clashed with Sikhs in northern India. The religion of Sikhism, a monotheistic faith that combines elements of Hinduism and Islam, was established in the Punjab region of northwestern India in the 15th century. The Mughals persecuted the Sikhs, and Aurangzeb sought to control the succession of Sikh gurus, the community's religious and political leaders. His execution of the Guru Tegh Bahadur inspired even greater resistance to Mughal authority. Among the many Hindus who opposed Aurangzeb were the Marathas, a group from the western uplands of the Deccan Plateau. Many Marathas had gained experience as soldiers in the armies of both the Muslim and Hindu rulers. The most powerful of their leaders, Shivaji, had acquired his military experience in this way, figure 2-9. When he led his own armies into battle against Mughal forces, he proved a formidable opponent, defeating Aurangzeb's commanders time after time. Shivaji's success on the field of battle and the rich spoils that fell to his troops attracted many followers. In 1663, he defeated a much larger Mughal army after withstanding a siege for more than 2 years. Less than a year after this victory, Shivaji's forces invaded Gujarat and seized control of the port of Surat. This painting depicts Emperor Shivaji. He wears a richly decorated white tunic and ornate jewelry. He carries a sword in his left hand. Figure 2-9 Emperor Shivaji of the Maratha. This portrait, painted in the 1680s, depicts the Maratha Emperor Shivaji dressed for battle. Credit: Portrait of Shivaji by the British Museum/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Aurangzeb attempted to make an ally of Shivaji, summoning him to the Mughal court in 1666 and awarding his son, who was still a child, a royal title. Shivaji was treated with contempt by his Mughal hosts, however, and following Aurangzeb's attempts to detain him, he escaped and resumed war against the Mughals. 8 years later, Shivaji had himself declared an emperor on par with Aurangzeb, in effect declaring his right to rule his own territory and placing himself in a position of authority above other Maratha leaders. Shivaji sought to eliminate Mughal influence by making the local language of Marathi the vernacular of his court instead of Persian, the language of the Mughals. He ran his court according to Hindu tradition and replaced Persian political terminology with terms from Sanskrit, the sacred language of Hinduism. All educated Hindus were familiar with Sanskrit, unlike Marathi, which Hindus in other parts of India could not be expected to speak. Sanskrit served a function in Shivaji's kingdom, similar to that served by Latin in medieval Europe or Chinese in East Asia. It was the language of the educated elite. Shivaji led processions to local Hindu holy sites and also patronized Sanskrit scholars. Despite his dedication to Hinduism, however, he gave money to Islamic institutions and did not discriminate against Muslims. When Aurangzeb imposed a tax on non-Muslims in the Mughal Empire, Shivaji wrote to inform him that he could not be a good Muslim if he did not understand that God had created all people, not only Muslims. Beginning in 1674, Shivaji embarked on a campaign to subdue the southern and central parts of the Indian subcontinent and bring them under the control of the Maratha Empire, figure 210. Although he died in 1680, the war between the Mughals and the Marathas continued. Years of fighting emptied Mughal coffers, and in 1705, Maratha armies gained control of the Gujarat coast. Stretched too thin, the Mughals began their retreat from Maratha territory. This map shows India. The highlighted region of the Maratha Empire covers all central India. Figure 2. 10. The Maratha Empire. This illustration from a 1760 English school book shows, in yellow, the extent of the Maratha Empire after its defeat of the Mughals. Credit. Modification of work. The India Subcontinent in 1760 by Charles Colbeck / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. As the Mughals grew weaker, the Marathas grew stronger. Over the course of the next 20 years, Maratha armies gained control of roughly one-third of India. The Maratha bid to dominate all of India was brought to a halt, however, when Ahmed Shah Durrani, the king of Afghanistan, marched eastward against both the Mughal and Maratha empires, seeking to expand his domain. As Indians and Afghans made war on one another, European colonizers steadily gained control of India. European colonialism. In 1488, a Portuguese ship's captain, Bartolomeu Dias, had sailed around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, but his restless crew made him turn back before he could further explore the Indian Ocean. Dias was one of many Portuguese explorers who had ventured out into the Atlantic Ocean in the 15th century, following Portugal's capture of the Muslim port of Ceuta on the Moroccan coast in 1415. Ceuta lay at the end of caravan routes that brought the gold of West Africa across the Sahara Desert. After he assumed the throne in 1433, King Edward of Portugal granted to his younger brother Henry, nicknamed the Navigator by historians in the 19th century, the right to authorize exploration south of Cape Bajador on the northwest coast of Morocco. Edward also gave Henry the rights to any profits derived from trade with regions that these explorers discovered. Eager to find the source of West Africa's gold, Henry sponsored voyages down the African coast. Gradually, the Portuguese advanced southward, establishing trading posts as they went. Although gold was the main object of trade, enslaved people were also purchased and sold in Lisbon. Henry collected a 20% tax on the trade and used the money to fund yet more voyages. After the fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire in 1453, access to the known routes to spices and other Asian goods that Europeans desired lay entirely in Muslim hands. Other Europeans had long resented the monopolization of the spice trade by the Venetians and Genoese, who had been granted trading concessions by the Ottomans. Now, there was an even greater incentive to find new routes to the lands of the East. It was for this reason that, in 1492, Christopher Columbus, in the employ of Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain, ventured out into the Atlantic in search of an oceanic route to India. In 1494, following Columbus's landing in the Caribbean, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, ratifying Pope Alexander VI's decision that all non-Christian lands west of a line drawn 100 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of Africa, which Portugal already claimed, were to belong to Spain. Non-Christian lands east of the line were given to Portugal, figure 211. 4 years later, another Portuguese sailor, Vasco da Gama, became the first European to sail all the way to India after rounding the Cape of Good Hope. This map shows much of the world. Spain and Portugal in Europe are highlighted. The 1493 Papal Division line runs horizontally, running through the middle of Greenland, the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and the easternmost tip of South America. The 1494 treaty line is a few more degrees west. It runs horizontally through West Greenland, the western Atlantic Ocean, and eastern South America. Figure 2:11 The Treaty of Tordesillas. Without reference to the sovereignty of the people who lived there, the Treaty of Tordesillas granted all lands in Africa and Asia to Portugal. Spain received the Americas except the easternmost portion of South America, which eventually became the Portuguese colony of Brazil. Credit, Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494 by Ultimatescience/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. In 1498, da Gama sailed north along the east coast of Africa, and from there across the Indian Ocean to the southwestern coast of India, where he landed in the port of Calicut, Kozhikode, in what is today the state of Kerala, figure 2:12. Da Gama had come to India on a quest to find an all-water route to Southeast and East Asia, the source of spices, silks, porcelains, and other Asian goods. Europeans had had access to such luxuries for centuries, but they were expensive. They had to be carried overland, which limited the amounts that could be brought to Europe, and they also passed through the hands of many intermediaries between their point of origin and their European consumers. Finding an all-water route to the source was intended to eliminate these problems, and the nation that did so stood to become very wealthy. Before the voyages of the Portuguese, trade with Asia had been monopolized by northern Italian merchants, especially the Venetians, to the envy of merchants in other countries. Da Gama hoped to change this. This map shows the Atlantic Ocean, Indian Ocean, Arabia, India, Africa, and parts of South America and Europe. The map highlights the India Run route from Portugal to India. The outward route inner, pre-July, runs from Europe, hugs the western coast of Africa, and then crosses the Atlantic Ocean, riding the currents of the South Atlantic gyro to the eastern coast of South America, turns east to go around the southern tip of Africa, goes in between Madagascar and continental Africa to India. The outward route outer, post-July, goes from the southern tip of Africa, around the eastern side of Madagascar, through the Indian Ocean to India. The return route inner goes from India, hugs the eastern coast of Africa, rounds the southern tip of Africa, travels northwest through the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and ends at Portugal. The return route outer goes from the southern tip of India through the middle of the Indian Ocean, stays on the eastern side of Madagascar, and ends in South Africa. Figure 2:12, the India Run. Working for Portugal, Vasco da Gama sailed north along the east coast of Africa and across the Indian Ocean to Calicut, in the southern Indian province of Kerala, establishing what became the typical sea route to India, the Carrera de India, or India Run. Credit, modification of work, map of Portuguese Carrera de India by Walraciad/Wikimedia Commons, CC by 30. Of all the goods da Gama sought, spices were the most desirable. They were used not only in cooking but also as ingredients in medicines, and their scents were employed to mask less pleasant odors. While this type of Portuguese ship, called a caravel, had relatively little space for cargo, a small amount of pepper and other spices would fit in the hold and still earn substantial profits in Europe. Caravels did have certain advantages. They were larger and sturdier than most craft that sailed in the Indian Ocean, and they were heavily armed, as well as relatively fast and stable in heavy seas. If merchants in India proved unwilling to sell to the Portuguese at the low prices the Europeans set, the caravels, captains blocked access to Indian ports so that Arab and Persian merchants were unable to trade. Da Gama's success in reaching India and the value of the goods with which he returned led to future expeditions. In 1500, Pedro Alvarez Cabral established a factory, a trading post with offices and warehouses, at Calicut to trade for pepper, and he also secured trade agreements from local rulers in Cochin, Kochi, and Kannur, both in Kerala. To eliminate competition, Cabral had his men seize Muslim merchant ships in the harbor, strip them of their cargoes and burn them, and he then bombarded the port. Approximately 600 Muslim sailors were killed. Indians attacked the Portuguese factory in Calicut to avenge the assault on the Muslim traders. Relations between local rulers and the Portuguese did not improve when da Gama returned in 1502. He demanded that all Arabs be expelled from Calicut, and when this order was refused, he bombarded the city as Cabral had done. Establishing a pattern that they and other Europeans later replicated throughout India, the Portuguese sought to divide and conquer by entering into alliance with some local rulers to the disadvantage of others, a strategy made easier in later decades by the weakening of the Mughal Empire. When the Portuguese allied with the ruler of Cochin, the hereditary ruler of Calicut, called the Zamorin, invaded Cochin in response. In retaliation, the Portuguese destroyed the fleet that sailed once a year from Calicut to Egypt to sell spices for the Zamorin. Beginning in 1502, the Portuguese also attempted to increase their revenues by demanding that ships trading in the Indian Ocean carry a cartaz, a document bearing the Christian cross. The money paid for this document went into the Portuguese royal coffers, and by forcing ships to sail to a Portuguese post in India to purchase one, the Portuguese government hoped also to increase commerce for its merchants in the ports it controlled. Ships that did not carry the cartaz had their cargoes seized and were sunk. Muslim, Jewish, and Hindu captains objected to having to bear a document with the Christian cross, and all non-Portuguese resented Portugal's attempts to dominate Indian Ocean trade. To protect their economic interests, a diverse and formidable group of opponents assembled to thwart these Portuguese efforts. Following the destruction of his spice fleet, the Hindu Zamorin of Calicut and Calicut's Muslim merchants turned to Egypt for help. At the time, the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt controlled not only that land, but also the Levant, Greater Syria, and much of the Arabian Peninsula as well. The Mamluks were an elite group of formerly enslaved warriors who ruled Egypt following the defeat of the Abbasid Caliphate. In the early 16th century, this area was the center of the spice trade with Europe that, before the arrival of the Portuguese in India, had been carried out by Venetian merchants in the port of Alexandria. Egypt's Sultan al-Ashraf Khansa al-Ghori thus asked Venice for assistance, which the city-state provided in the form of ships and gunners, figure 213. At the same time, spurred by a desire to combat the Muslims of the Indian Ocean, the King of Portugal sent a fleet to India. This woodcut portrait shows a man with a full beard wearing a tall hat and a cloak. The portrait is framed by smaller images of other people. Figure 213 Al-Ashraf Khansa al-Ghori. Shown in a woodcut portrait by his near contemporary, the Italian historian Paolo Giovio. Al-Ashraf Khansa al-Ghori was the second-to-last Mamluk Sultan of Egypt. In 1516, he was defeated in battle and killed by Ottoman forces. Credit: Portrait of Al-Ashraf Khansa al-Ghori by Paolo Giovio / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. In 1508, the Mamluk Sultan's Egyptian fleet, together with ships belonging to the Sultanate of Gujarat, clashed with Portuguese ships in the harbor of Chaul on the west coast of India. Although the Portuguese commander and his flagship were lost in the battle, the remainder of the Portuguese fleet escaped to the port of Cochin, and the Mamluks' fleet was too badly damaged to give pursuit. In 1509, the Portuguese decisively defeated a combined Egyptian-Gujarati Calicut fleet in the port of Diu, one of the main ports of the Sultanate of Gujarat. The Portuguese did not take control of Diu, but they received the right to establish a trading post there and a substantial payment in gold from the city's Muslim merchants. The Portuguese took possession of additional territory in India in subsequent years, including the city of Goa on the subcontinent's western coast. Goa became the base of the Portuguese state of India, the name Portugal gave to its holdings in the Indian Ocean. Jesuit priests accompanied Portuguese sailors, merchants, and soldiers to these ports, and began in earnest to convert Indians to Roman Catholicism. Although most Indians remained Hindu or Muslim, the Portuguese gained converts among lower-status Hindus who hoped that, by adopting the Portuguese religion, they might improve their social position. Some may also have believed that becoming Roman Catholics would enable them to do business with the Portuguese, just as converting to Islam may have seemed a wise business move for members of earlier generations of merchants. The Portuguese also won both converts and allies on the island known to them as Silao, or Ceylon in English, modern-day Sri Lanka, after once again taking advantage of divisions among local rulers. In 1551, the King of Kot was assassinated, and his Buddhist successor turned to the Portuguese for assistance in maintaining his hold on the throne amid a struggle with his brother, the King of Sitawaka, an ally of Calicut. The Portuguese erected a fortress on Ceylon and also proceeded to convert some of the population to Roman Catholicism, including Kot's new ruler. As a result, upon his death, the ruler of Kot left his kingdom to the King of Portugal. In 1565, Muslim rulers on the Deccan Plateau joined forces with the Zamorin of Calicut, the King of Sitawaka, and the Sultan of Aceh, Indonesia, to again attempt to expel the Portuguese in the War of the League of the Indies. They also sought help from the Ottoman Empire. The assistance of the Ottoman fleet would have helped counter Portuguese dominance of the seas, but the Ottomans' need to suppress revolts on the Arabian Peninsula and do battle with the city-state of Venice kept them from participating. Reports of the marvelous wealth of India and the riches amassed by Portuguese merchants encouraged the Europeans of other nations to seek their fortunes in the Indian Ocean. In 1600, Queen Elizabeth I of England granted a monopoly on trade in the Indian Ocean to the British East India Company, also known as the English East India Company or the East India Company. The British East India Company was a joint stock company in which numerous merchants pooled their money to fund trading voyages and share the profits. An expedition to India required an enormous outlay of money that few individuals could afford, and if they could, they might lose their entire fortunes if the expedition were unsuccessful. By pooling funds, none had to risk all they owned. Dutch and French merchants also formed joint stock East India companies. While the Dutch focused most of their attention on the islands of Indonesia, France competed with England and Portugal to harvest the wealth of India. In 1661, Charles II of England received Bombay, Mumbai, as part of the dowry of his Portuguese wife, Catherine of Braganza, and leased it to the British East India Company. France, in turn, established a trading post at Surat in 1668 and founded others in the years that followed. Europeans often partnered with Indian merchants who sought new investment opportunities outside the subcontinent. In 1685, the Mughal governor of Bengal increased taxes on English trade in the region. The British East India Company refused to pay and sought to wrest control of the territory from the Mughals. English ships blockaded Mughal ports on India's west coast, interfering with both Mughal trade and the passage of Muslim pilgrims on their way to Mecca. In response, the Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb seized control of company possessions and in 1689 began a blockade of Bombay, starving the English into submission. Company representatives were forced to pay a substantial fine before their trading privileges were returned to them. In their attempt to resist English expansion, the Mughals turned to the French for assistance. Already rivals in trade, beginning in 1754, France and Britain found themselves enmeshed in a war in North America for control of that continent. This conflict, called the French and Indian War, soon spread to Europe where fighting broke out in 1756. As part of this now global conflict, called the 7 Years' War, French and British armies and navies engaged in battle in India as well. France allied itself with the Mughal Empire. In 1756, the French, who had greatly expanded their commercial activity in Bengal, pressured the region's ruler to attack the British Fort William near Calcutta, Kolkata. The following year, the British struck back, defeating Bengali and French forces at the Battle of Plassey, allowing the British to trade unopposed in Bengal. In 1761, the British destroyed the French post of Pondicherry, Puducherry. With both the Mughals and the Marathas weakened after years of combat with one another as well as with invading Afghans and encroaching Europeans, small states in northern India broke away from their control and recognized British authority in exchange for acknowledgement of their claims to rule. The chaos that ensued helped the British in their quest to gain control of India. In this way, through a combination of alliances and military victories, and the use they made of existing divisions between its kingdoms and rulers, the British gradually gained control of India. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to identify the factors that led the rise of the Malacca Sultanate, discuss the significance of Malacca as a center of trade, analyze the Portuguese invasion of Malacca and its consequences. Like the Sultanate of Gujarat, the Malacca Sultanate was blessed by its geography. Located on the northern part of the Indonesian island of Sumatra and the southern part of the Malay Peninsula, it controlled access to the narrow Malaccan Straits, the most direct route between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, a branch of the Pacific Ocean. All trade moving between India, Southeast Asia, and China went through these waters. The rise of the Malacca Sultanate. When the remnants of the Srivijaya Empire on the island of Sumatra were destroyed by the Majapahit Empire in the 13th century, a refugee named Sang Nila Utama, who claimed to be a descendant of Alexander the Great, founded the Kingdom of Singapura on the island of Singapore. Singapura developed into a prosperous center of trade. However, its wealth led to attacks by both the Majapahit and the Ayutthaya Kingdom in Siam, now Thailand. In 1398, Singapura too was destroyed, and Paramaswara, its last king and a prince of the Srivijaya Empire, fled with his followers. He made his way to a fishing village at the mouth of the Malacca River on the Malay Peninsula that belonged to a tribe called the Orang Laut, Sea People. The Orang Laut had already given refuge to others fleeing from Majapahit, and a mixed population of Hindus, Buddhists, and Muslims had taken up residence there. Paramaswara, supposedly inspired by the courage of a small deer that did not fear his hunting dogs, decided this was the spot on which to build a new kingdom. The city Paramaswara and his followers founded in around 1400, called Malacca, became a thriving trading port that grew to occupy both the northern coast of Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, on either side of the Malaccan Straits. Figure 2. 14. The Orang Laut kept the seas in the area free of pirates, and Arab, Persian, Indian, and Chinese merchants came to do business. Many decided to stay. Paramaswara married the daughter of an Indonesian Muslim ruler and converted to Islam, changing his name to Iskander, Persian for Alexander, and taking the title of Sultan. This enabled Malacca to form close relationships with other Muslim states on Sumatra that traded with Gujarat. Through the Malaccan Straits flowed silks, spices, and porcelain, as well as Malaccan products such as tin that was mined to the north of the city. The Malaccans also planted orchards of sago palms, which provided an important foodstuff, a starchy ingredient of bread and noodles that was traded throughout the region. This map of Southeast Asia highlights the Malacca Sultanate, which includes the Malay Peninsula and part of Sumatra. The city of Malacca is labeled and lies on the southwestern coast of the Malay Peninsula. Figure 2. 14. The Malacca Sultanate. The heart of the Malacca Sultanate was Malacca, a port city located on the narrow Straits of Malacca, the most direct route between India, the islands of Indonesia, and the Pacific Ocean. Credit. Modification of work, Bandasi by Demi/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Malacca also established relations with China's Ming dynasty, whose Admiral Zheng he visited Malacca 6 times during the voyages he undertook in the service of the Yongle Emperor. When the growing power of Siam's Ayutthaya kingdom threatened Malacca, Ming envoys let the Siamese know that Malacca was a vassal state of China, and thus not to be interfered with. By the time the Ming dynasty had turned inward in the mid-15th century and ceased to trouble itself with matters involving foreign states, Malacca had grown strong enough to fend off Ayutthaya and repulsed 2 attacks made by that kingdom in 1446 and 1456. With Ayutthaya no longer a threat, the Sultanate of Malacca was free to spread its influence and the religion of Islam throughout Southeast Asia. From Malacca, religious teachers, many of them Sufis, brought Islam across the Malay Peninsula, and people on nearby islands also became converts. The sultans of Malacca and other Muslim rulers paid generously for the construction of mosques and religious schools. Figure 215. By the early 1600s, Islam had become the dominant religion in the Indian Ocean, and only on the island of Bali was Hindu influence still substantial. On Java, the home of the Hindu-Buddhist Majapahit Empire, the adoption of Islam was marked by warfare between Muslims living on the coast and Hindus and animists, people who worship the supernatural power they believe exists in all things in the universe, in the interior. For the most part, however, conversion was peaceful. Merchants were especially eager to convert in order to connect themselves with the established network of merchants in India, Persia, Arabia, and Africa who followed the same faith. They could then also count on the protections of Islamic law. Sufi religious teachers were amenable to adapting Islam to local religious traditions, allowing people in some regions to continue worshiping nature spirits and permitting women to retain an active role in local commerce, as was common in Southeast Asia. This photograph shows the Menara Kudus Mosque complex. To the left is a brown tower with a clock at the top. To the right is a building topped with a large silver dome and 2 smaller sliver domes. Figure 2. 15. The Menara Kudus Mosque. The Menara Kudus Mosque on the island of Java was built in 1549. One of the oldest mosques in Indonesia, it was among many erected by pious Muslim rulers. Credit. Masjid Menara Kudus by PL09 Parion/Wikimedia Commons, CC010. Malacca reached the height of its power in the late 15th century under the reigns of Sultan Mansur Shah and his son, Sultan Alauddin Riayat Shah. During this period, often thought of as the Golden Age of Malacca, Mansur Shah pursued an expansionist policy, adding the gold-rich state of Pahang on the east coast of the Malay Peninsula to his kingdom. The ruler of Majapahit, fearing Malacca's strength, sought peace by marrying his daughter to Mansur Shah and conceding to him a number of Majapahit territories. States throughout the Malaysian archipelago acknowledged the ruler of Malacca as their overlord. Link to learning. Read about the Malay legend of Puteri Gunung Ledang, or the fairy princess of Mount Ophir. Note how different features of the story are related to historical incidents and real people. What does this legend indicate about the wealth and power of the Malaccan sultans? Assisting the sultans of Malacca to maintain control over the city were 9 elite knights. Preeminent among them was Hang Tuah, who spoke multiple languages including Arabic, Persian, and Mandarin, and was adept in the use of numerous weapons. It was his responsibility to guard the seas surrounding the Straits of Malacca and keep them free of pirates. Order was also maintained by the establishment of the office of Shabandar. Foreign traders were divided among 4 separate districts in the city, and each district was assigned an official known as the Shabandar to supervise them and collect taxes. A legal code called the Undang-Undang Malacca, Law of Malacca, governed conduct in the port. Influenced by Islamic law, it punished behavior such as robbery, adultery, and drunkenness. One of the most important parts of the legal code for merchants was the section on maritime law called the Undang-Undang Laut Malacca. This code governed everything from the behavior of sailors and traveling merchants toward the captain of the merchant vessel, to the order in which trade was to take place when the ship put into port. The captain was allowed to trade his goods first, to rules specifying how those who quarreled or stole other passengers' property should be treated. The Malaccan rulers' ability to regulate the conduct of sailors and merchants both in their city and aboard their ships made the port a more desirable place in which to do business. Merchants need not fear that Malacca was a lawless place, as many ports were. The city quickly became the main port for trading Indian cloth and Chinese porcelain, as well as goods such as spices from the Malay archipelago. This growth in the wealth and prominence of Malacca helped make the 15th century a golden age. The dominance of Malacca in the Indian Ocean trade spread the Undang-Undang Malacca throughout the islands of Indonesia. It also made the Malay language the premier language of trade throughout the coastal regions of Southeast Asia. In the 14th century, a special script for writing it was developed, based on Arabic script. In the 15th century, Malaysian literature, which had been transmitted only orally before, flourished, another characteristic of this golden age in the Malaccan Sultanate. European Malacca. In 1509, a Portuguese fleet arrived in Malacca, bringing Diogo Lopes de Sequeira with orders from the King of Portugal to establish trade with Malacca, which would allow Portugal to replace Venice as the center of the spice trade in Europe. According to Tomé Piers, the apothecary to the King of Portugal who traveled to Southeast Asia in search of spices, "Whoever is Lord of Malacca has his hand on the throat of Venice." The reigning Sultan Mahmud Shah and others at his court were intrigued by the possibility of becoming trading partners with the Portuguese, and possibly putting Portugal's warships to use against rival kingdoms, as some Indian rulers had done. Many Indian Muslims in Malacca, however, especially Gujaratis, were aware of Portuguese attacks on Muslim merchants in India and opposed any dealings with the Europeans. Initially, Mahmud Shah gave the Portuguese permission to establish a factory, a trading post. But then, on the advice of Indian and Javanese Muslim merchants, he sent ships to attack them in 1510. Sequeira and his ships managed to escape, but several Portuguese were taken captive. In 1511, the Portuguese military commander Alfonso de Albuquerque arrived from India at the head of a large fleet bearing more than 1,000 armed troops, and demanded the return of those Portuguese who had been taken prisoner the year before. The Sultan delayed as he attempted to assemble an army to defeat the Portuguese, but after a week of waiting, Albuquerque bombarded the city. The prisoners were promptly released, but the Sultan refused Albuquerque's demands for reparations and the right to build a fortress. Albuquerque then landed his troops in the city with the help of Hindu, Chinese, and Burmese merchants, who hoped to use Portuguese influence to gain dominance over their Muslim rivals. Within a month, the Portuguese had gained control of Malacca, and Mahmud Shah had fled. Albuquerque erected a fortress to guard the city's entrance and made Nina Chatu, a Hindu merchant who had helped free the Portuguese prisoners, the city's chief administrator. Newly minted coins were distributed, and people were informed that trade would go on as before. Things did not go quite as the Portuguese planned, however. The deposed sultan established a new base in the Riau Islands of Indonesia, and from there launched attacks on the Portuguese in Malacca. Following his death in 1528, Mahmud Shah's sons continued to attack the Portuguese from their kingdoms in Johor and Perak. Unwilling to do business in Portuguese Malacca, many Muslim merchants avoided the port and conducted trade in either Johor or the Sultanate of Aceh on the northern coast of Sumatra. In 1606, the government of the Netherlands, eager to gain an advantage over its European competitors, signed a treaty with the Sultan of Johor. In exchange for help destroying the Portuguese in Malacca and freeing Johor from Aceh's domination, the Sultan promised the Dutch control of the port with the understanding that they would make no further territorial conquests in the region or attack Johor. In 1629, with Dutch assistance, forces from Johor destroyed Aceh's navy and killed nearly 20,000 Aceh troops. In 1641, the Dutch and troops from Johor defeated the Portuguese, and the Dutch East India Company took control of Malacca. The Portuguese had not been satisfied to take just Malacca. They had a greater prize in mind, the legendary Spice Islands, the source of the nutmeg, mace, and cloves they coveted. Having learned of the location of the Banda Islands in the Indonesian archipelago, where nutmeg and cloves grew in abundance, Afonso de Albuquerque dispatched 3 ships with Malay pilots to find them, believing them to be the Spice Islands. The hostility of the Bandanese, however, dissuaded the Portuguese from attempting to establish a factory there. One of the original 3 ships sailed on in search of another spice-rich island group, the Moluccas, Malacu. Figure 2:16. Here, the Portuguese were able to establish trade relationships with the Sultanate of Ternate, a city-state in the Moluccas. This map shows the Philippines, Singapore, Indonesia, and a portion of Australia. The Banda Islands are labeled at the bottom right of the map, in between Indonesia and Australia. Figure 2:16. The Banda Islands. The Banda Islands, a spice-rich island group, lie in the center of the Moluccas, an archipelago in the east of Indonesia. Attribution: Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC BY 40 license. The primary interest of Sultan Harun of Ternate was in using Portuguese military power in his contests with rival states. The Portuguese, meanwhile, had nervously noted that visitors from Mecca, the Ottoman Empire, and other Southeast Asian Islamic sultanates frequented Ternate. As Catholics who sought to convert the people of the Indian Ocean to their religion, and who considered Muslims enemies, they feared the growth of Islam in the region would interfere with both their commercial and evangelical efforts and might endanger their safety. Eventually, Portuguese efforts to convert people to Christianity angered Muslim inhabitants and strengthened their devotion to Islam. After Harun's death, his son and heir Sultan Babila declared a holy war against the Portuguese and drove them from the Moluccas in 1575. Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese veteran of Albuquerque's attack on Malacca, also dreamed of finding a route to the Spice Islands. He planned, however, to discover a westward route by sailing west from Portugal, instead of taking the long route eastward around the tip of Africa and through the Indian Ocean. When the Portuguese king declined to fund the exploratory voyage, Magellan approached the King of Spain, who provided him with the funds and ships he needed. The crew came from many countries, which was common aboard ships at that time. In 1519, with a fleet of 5 ships and a crew of 270, Magellan departed from Spain. He crossed the Atlantic and sailed around the southern tip of South America, where the fleet spent the winter. On March 6, 1521, with their fresh water nearly exhausted after 3 months spent crossing the Pacific, they sighted Guam, and not long after, they made landfall in the Philippines. At the port of Sugbu on the island of Cebu, Magellan and the Spanish were welcomed by the ruler, Raja Humabon, whose ancestor, a prince of the South India Chola dynasty, had come to the Philippines from Sumatra. As other Portuguese had done, Magellan attempted to convert the people he encountered to Christianity. Humabon, his wives, and many of his subjects agreed. By converting, Humabon hoped to secure Magellan's assistance in defeating Lapu-Lapu, a rival ruler. Magellan consented to the plan, and at the Battle of Mactan on April 27, 1521, he was killed. Humabon, for unknown reasons, attacked Magellan's remaining men. The survivors fled to the Moluccas and from there sailed home to Spain. Only 18 men survived the voyage, and Spanish ships did not return to the Philippines until 1565, when they conquered Cebu. Then in 1570, the Spanish attacked the Muslim trading center of Manila when one of its rulers refused to become an ally of Spain. The Filipinos were defeated, and in 1571, the Spanish established the city of Manila, which became their capital in the East Indies. The past meets the present. Lapu-Lapu, a Filipino folk hero. Lapu-Lapu, the indigenous leader who defied and defeated Ferdinand Magellan, has been a folk hero in the Philippines for hundreds of years, representing the spirit of the Filipino people and their unwillingness to be dictated to by non-Filipinos. He is referred to as Kali-Pulaco in the 1614 poem, Que Dios le perdone, May God Pardon Him, by Filipino poet Carlos Calao. Another spelling of his name, Kalipulaku, was used by the Filipino activist Mariano Ponce when he agitated for the Philippines' independence from Spain in the 19th century. Lapu-Lapu is also mentioned in the 1898 Declaration of Independence. In the 20th century, statues of him were erected in Manila, the capital of the Philippines, Figure 2:17, and on Mactan Island, the site of Magellan's defeat. His image has appeared on Filipino currency, and he is shown in silhouette holding his weapons on the seal of the Philippine National Police. He is invoked in songs and has appeared as a character in films and television shows. Filipino Muslims have tried to claim him as a hero of Islam, even though he was most likely not Muslim. In 2017, Rodrigo Duterte, then president of the Philippines, proclaimed April 27, the anniversary of the Battle of Mactan, to be Lapu-Lapu Day. This photograph shows a bronze statue of Lapu-Lapu who wears a loincloth and holds a large sword. Figure 2:17 Lapu-Lapu. This bronze monument to Lapu-Lapu was designed by Juan Saged Imao and erected in Manila in 2004. 40 feet high, it is called the Statue of the Sentinel of Freedom. Credit: Lapu-Lapu by Jason Audrey Licerio/Flickr, CC by 20. Why do you think Filipinos still revere Lapu-Lapu? Why are Muslims eager to claim him as a member of their faith, who might be the U.S. equivalent of Lapu-Lapu? Why? In 1609, the Dutch East India Company attempted to establish a fortress in the Banda Islands. The men sent to negotiate the agreement with the Bandanese were killed, however. In 1621, the Dutch returned and forced the inhabitants to sign a treaty. When the Bandanese violated the treaty's terms, Dutch soldiers and Japanese mercenaries killed many of the community's most important leaders and burned their villages. The surviving islanders were forced to cut down sago palm trees, a valuable source of food, and plant spice trees in their place. The island's land was divided up and given to Dutch colonists, and enslaved Southeast Asians, European indentured servants, and convict laborers were set to work raising nutmeg, which was sold to the Dutch East India Company. The exception was Ambon Island, which the Dutch set aside to grow cloves. Clove trees on all other islands were destroyed, and anyone attempting to grow or sell cloves without permission was given the death penalty. To maintain a monopoly on the spices and thus keep prices high, the Dutch had already driven out English settlers attempting to colonize some of the outlying islands. And then, realizing they might be unable to control these islands, they destroyed all the nutmeg trees that grew there. In 1619, the Dutch also sent enslaved Bandanese to Java to build the Dutch settlement of Batavia, Jakarta. The Dutch attempt to maintain their spice monopoly was destined to fail, however. Winds and seabirds spread seeds to other islands. Ships, captains from other countries managed to return to Europe with holds filled with spices purchased from Southeast Asian kingdoms that had not fallen under the control of European powers. The English captain Sir Francis Drake, for example, purchased cloves from Sultan Babbala of Ternate. As ships grew larger, the volume of spices shipped to European ports increased, driving down prices and profits. The Dutch were not solely reliant on the spice trade, however, for they were able to take advantage of an opportunity not available to the Portuguese and Spanish, dedicated as they were to the propagation of Roman Catholicism. That opportunity was trade with Japan. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to identify the factors that affected exchanges between Japan, its East Asian neighbors, and Europeans. Analyze how interactions with Europe influenced China during the Ming and Qing dynasties. Describe China's relationship with its neighbors during the Ming and Qing dynasties. Discuss the importance of education, culture, and science to Korean national identity. Indian Ocean societies welcomed cultural and economic exchanges among people of many different ethnicities and religions. East Asian societies, however, had a different response to such exchanges. While Japan, China, and Korea were members of the same economic networks as the societies of the Indian Ocean and participated in some of the same cultural trades, they attempted, with varying degrees of success, to limit the effects at home of contact with outsiders and their ideas. Japan. In the 1400s, Japan was locked in what seemed to be unending internal strife. The Ashikaga shoguns, military overlords, who supposedly ruled the country, were too weak to prevent their vassals from fighting one another or to deal with pirate bands that attacked the coasts of Japan, Korea, and China. Figure 2. 18. Powerful samurai began to style themselves daimyos, great lords, and ruled their territories as if they were independent kingdoms. They imposed their own laws, collected tolls from those who entered, and recruited warriors loyal only to them, instead of to the shogun or the emperor. From this period of chaos emerged a succession of three powerful samurai who came to be known as the Three Unifiers. Beginning in the 1560s, Oda Nobunaga began to unite Japan under his rule. He was succeeded by Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu. These men ended the incessant violence, united Japan under a strong central government, and defined the relationship their nation had with the West. This map shows the locations of China, Korea, and Japan. China is a large region in the southeastern part of Asia. Korea is a peninsula and borders China. Japan is an island east of Asia. Figure 2. 18 East Asian societies. In the 16th and 17th centuries, China, Japan, and Korea all attempted to limit the effects of contact with outsiders and their ideas. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 40 license. In 1543, Portuguese ships arrived in Japan. It was the logical end point of a route that had taken them around the coast of Africa, eastward through the Indian Ocean, and into the Pacific. They wished to trade. They also wished to win converts for the Roman Catholic Church, as they had done elsewhere in Asia. The Portuguese were soon followed by the Spanish in 1549, and on the heels of the Portuguese and Spanish came the Dutch and the English. These last two nations, however, were less interested in religion than in profit. The Jesuit priests brought by the Spanish and Portuguese proved quite successful at winning souls. Those like Gaspar Viola, who arrived in Japan in 1556, often learned the Japanese language so they could communicate directly with converts. By 1600, more than 100,000 Japanese had become Roman Catholics, and half the Jesuits serving in Japan were Japanese. Nagasaki, on the southern island of Kyushu, was the most Christianized community in Japan and had 10 churches. Although most samurai were not interested in becoming Roman Catholics, they were nevertheless interested in something else the Europeans had to offer: guns. Many daimyos became Christian or offered the missionaries support in an effort to obtain weapons and gunpowder to assist them in their battles with rival samurai. Guns had a great impact on Japanese warfare, even though they were difficult to aim and slow to reload. One gun did not give its possessor an advantage in battle over opponents armed with swords, pikes, or lances. However, when soldiers massed together and groups of them fired in succession, as Europeans fought, they could easily defeat those armed with traditional Japanese weapons. Oda Nobunaga made use of this new style of fighting. In 1575, at the Battle of Nagashino, he and his vassal Tokugawa Ieyasu used companies of samurai armed with European guns to defeat the warriors of the Taikta clan. By 1582, the year he was assassinated by one of his vassals, Oda had unified the central portion of the main Japanese island of Honshu, including the area surrounding Kyoto, the seat of the emperor. Upon Oda's death, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a vassal of his, succeeded to his position after defeating the army of Oda's assassin. By 1590, Hideyoshi had defeated all the daimyos in Japan and required that they declare their loyalty to him. He disarmed non-samurai and forbade peasants to leave the land or become soldiers, while also forbidding samurai to take up any occupation other than war. Unlike Oda Nobunaga, who had been relatively unconcerned with the activities of Christians, Hideyoshi was more suspicious of them. A devout Buddhist, he disapproved of Christians eating of cattle and horses, and was horrified by the destruction of Buddhist temples and objects of worship by some overly zealous converts, acts in which Gaspar Viola had participated. In 1587, Hideyoshi ordered Christian missionaries to leave Japan. The edict was not enforced, but the Jesuits, alarmed, asked Christian daimyos to help them attack the shogun, which they refused to do. In 1590, the Jesuits in Japan resolved instead to refrain from intervening in Japanese affairs, but they secretly continued to provide funds for Christian daimyos. Neither approach was completely successful in avoiding Hideyoshi's ire. In 1596, the San Felipe, a Spanish ship sailing from the Philippines to Mexico, was caught in typhoons in the Pacific and wrecked on a sandbar in the harbor of Yurado, on the Japanese island of Shikoku. The local daimyo confiscated the vessel's cargo, which Japanese law allowed, and when the ship's captain protested, the daimyo suggested he approach Mashita Nagamori, one of the shogun's officials, for assistance. Accordingly, the Spanish captain sent 2 men to the capital of Kyoto to meet with Nagamori. There they produced a map of Spain's empire in the Americas and explained how converting the indigenous population to Christianity had helped Spain to gain control of this vast territory. Nagamori reported this information to Hideyoshi, perhaps with the intent of providing an excuse for retaining hold of the ship's cargo. Fearing that the Spanish intended to conquer Japan and planned to seek assistance from Japanese Christians, Hideyoshi ordered the arrest of the missionaries who had remained in Japan in violation of his 1587 decree. The Jesuits, however, had deliberately made their proselytizing efforts less public since 1587, and they were largely being ignored. Thus, of the 26 Christians arrested, most were Japanese, and 23 were of the Franciscan order. In February 1597, all were crucified in Nagasaki. They became known as the 26 Martyrs of Japan, in their own words. The expulsion of the missionaries. In 1587, Toyotomi Hideyoshi ordered Christian missionaries to leave Japan. He had not always been opposed to Christianity. Some of his loyal daimyos were Christians, and Christians had offered prayers for his success when he invaded Korea. Like his predecessor Oda Nobunaga, Hideyoshi was willing to tolerate Christianity if it did not disrupt traditional Japanese practices or interfere with his plans to consolidate his power over other samurai. By 1587, however, He had become convinced that it posed too many threats. Following are the edicts he issued in 1587. As you read, note the various reasons he gives for expelling the missionaries. 1. Japan is the country of the gods, but has been receiving false teachings from Christian countries. This cannot be tolerated any further. 2. The missionaries approach people in provinces and districts to make them their followers, and let them destroy shrines and temples. This is an unheard of outrage. When a vassal receives a province, a district, a village, or another form of a fief, he must consider it as a property entrusted to him on a temporary basis. He must follow the laws of this country and abide by their intent. However, some vassals illegally commend part of their fiefs to the church. This is a culpable offense. 3. The Padres Catholic priests, by their special knowledge in the sciences and medicine, feel that they can at will entice people to become their believers. In doing so, they commit the illegal act of destroying the teachings of Buddha prevailing in Japan. These padres cannot be permitted to remain in Japan. They must prepare to leave the country within 20 days of the issuance of this notice. 4. The black Portuguese and Spanish ships come to Japan to engage in trade. Thus the matter is a separate one. They can continue to engage in trade. 5. Hereafter, anyone who does not hinder the teachings of the Buddha, whether he be a merchant or not, may come and go freely from Christian countries to Japan. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Edict, Expulsion of Missionaries. How tolerant was Toyotomi Hideyoshi of European Christians? What specific actions angered him? Why? Does Hideyoshi object to the Christian faith itself? Explain your answer. In 1592, Hideyoshi invaded Korea, a vassal state of the Ming dynasty, but Chinese troops stopped the Japanese advance. In 1597, he attacked again and was again defeated, this time by Chinese and Korean troops and Korea's navy. In 1598, he died, leaving his 5-year-old son Hideyori to inherit his position. However, the 5-member council that was to rule until Hideyori came of age was soon divided, and the two sides made war upon each other. In 1600, Tokugawa Ieyasu, a vassal of Hideyoshi, defeated his opponents at the Battle of Sekigahara, figure 219, and he became shogun in 1603. This painting shows a large battle by samurai armies. Many samurai carry flags. Hills are visible in the background. Figure 2:19, the Battle of Sekigahara. This illustration on a 19th century Japanese screen shows the 1600 Battle of Sekigahara. Approximately 160,000 samurai clashed over a period of 6 hours. Credit: Sekigahara Kasen Byabuzi, by the City of Gifu Museum of History / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Link to learning. Visit My Modern Met to see an animation of the Battle of Sekigahara through the work of videographer Yusuke Shichita, who reconstructed the battle by animating a painted folded screen. To consolidate power, Tokugawa Ieyasu rewarded loyal daimyos with gifts of land. He allocated 15% of Japan's richest rice-producing land to himself and his heirs. The next best land, about half of that available, was given to his inside daimyos, samurai who were related to him, or who had declared their loyalty before the Battle of Sekigahara. The remaining land, less fertile or farthest away from the new capital of Edo, modern-day Tokyo, was given to the outside daimyos, samurai clans that had proclaimed loyalty only after his victory or that had fought against him. Ieyasu prohibited daimyos from forming alliances, including marriages, without his approval. He also required them to spend every other year in Edo, where it would be more difficult for them to formulate rebellion. The peace and unity that Tokugawa Ieyasu's rule brought to Japan ushered in a period of prosperity and cultural blossoming. The daimyos took control of the lands that had belonged to their samurai, and the samurai moved to the cities in which their lords' castles were located. The daimyos established schools where the sons of their vassals studied Chinese characters, learned the Confucian classics, and were instructed in military skills. Temple schools taught the children of artisans and merchants. Tokugawa Japan boasted a high level of literacy, which supported a thriving publishing industry. In Edo alone, there were hundreds of shops in which people could buy or rent novels and other types of books. People visited restaurants and theaters in their leisure time, and those who could afford to do so traveled to Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines, often at festival time. Like Hideyoshi, Ieyasu also feared that Christians posed a threat to Japan, a belief Dutch and English merchants seeking trade advantages encouraged. Ieyasu was aware of hostile Portuguese and Spanish actions in India and the Philippines, and did not intend to surrender control of Japan. He also feared that by adopting the foreign faith, he would give disloyal daimyos opportunities to conspire against him. He was encouraged in this belief when a Christian samurai forged a document to help another Christian samurai claim land he desired, and a scandal erupted. The forger caught also claimed that a plan existed to kill an official of the shogun's government. In 1614, Ieyasu outlawed the practice of Christianity and ordered missionaries to leave the country. Japanese Christians were warned that if they did not renounce their faith, they would be killed. It was clear to Ieyasu that the best way to keep Christian influence and other dangerous forces out of the country was to ban the entry of foreigners and forbid Japanese to leave. Preventing Japanese from leaving the country would also keep daimyos from conspiring against him in foreign lands. In 1624, the Spanish were banned from entering Japan. In 1639, Ieyasu prohibited the entry of the Portuguese. The Dutch, who had refrained from missionary activity, were still allowed to enter Japan to trade. However, to limit any harmful influence on their part, Dutch merchants were confined to a settlement on Dejima Island in the harbor of Nagasaki. In a walled compound they were not allowed to leave. Only licensed trade officials and translators, a position that became hereditary, could have contact with them. The English might have been extended the same rights, but finding trade with Japan not as profitable as they had hoped, they no longer sent ships. Chinese merchants were also still allowed to enter the country, but their trade was confined to Nagasaki, and they were forced to live in a special Chinese enclave. In 1635, Japanese were forbidden to leave the country except on special missions, like transacting trade with Korea, China, and Russia. Despite efforts of the shogun's government to prevent Japanese contact with Europeans, Dutch learning, knowledge gained from the Dutch on Dejima, played an important part in Japanese life in the 17th and 18th centuries. In 1640, European books were banned with the exception of medical treatises and books on sailing. In subsequent years, the bans intended to isolate Japanese from Western knowledge relaxed. Ailing Japanese who could not find relief from Japanese doctors visited physicians on Dejima. Trade in Western goods was allowed to some extent in Nagasaki, and government officials were allowed to purchase maps, clocks, medical instruments, telescopes, and novelties like European seeds and birds. In the early 18th century, prohibitions on books were relaxed, and works on medicine, science, and geography were translated. Thus, Dutch learning provided a foundation for Japanese scientific and technological development and kept people informed of what was happening in Europe, even though most could not leave the country. China's dynastic exchanges. Japan was not the only nation that turned inward in the 17th century. China did so as well when the Hongwu Emperor, the first Ming Dynasty emperor, attempted to reverse the effects of foreign occupation after defeating the Mongols in 1368. To prevent the dangerous effect of outside ideas and potential challenges to his rule, Hongwu decided that Chinese contact with foreign lands would consist primarily of visits by vassals from tributary states. By limiting trade to the exchange of tribute goods, China also hoped to pressure other nations, which greatly desired its products, to accede to its demands. One of the strongest of these demands was that the Ashikaga shoguns prevent Japanese pirates from preying on China and its vassal state of Korea, which the Japanese rulers were unable to do. In 1371, all private foreign trade was forbidden. Several years later, all foreign trade officially came to an end when the maritime trade intendancies, offices in the port cities of Ningbo, Guangzhou, and Quanzhou, through which all tribute goods were to flow, were closed. Harbors were filled with rocks and wooden stakes to prevent ships from using them. Ships were destroyed or left to rot in their docks. A shore patrol was instituted to catch anyone attempting to engage in trade. Though the punishment was death, smugglers widely violated the rule. By cutting off access to foreign trade outside the tribute system, the Ming government greatly reduced its tax revenue, which left it constantly short of funds. To reduce the cost of government, Hongwu made wealthier peasant families responsible for collecting taxes and maintaining order in their villages, saving the expense of paying officials to do so. Soldiers' families were given land to farm in order to make the army self-supporting. High taxes were imposed on merchants and scholarly elites. These reforms were largely unsuccessful. Soldiers often could not raise enough food to support themselves, and either sold the land they had been given or deserted. Even wealthy peasants could not always afford to provide the services the government expected of them. Local officials lacked necessary funds, and they began to impose additional fees on peasants. Hongwu's son, the Yongle Emperor, the third emperor of the Ming dynasty, was a bit more curious about the world outside China and more desirous of tribute than his father. Between 1405 and 1421, he dispatched Zheng He, a trusted palace eunuch, on a series of 6 voyages throughout the Indian Ocean. The purpose of these voyages was to demonstrate the wealth and power of China by distributing gifts to foreign rulers, thus prompting them to pledge themselves as vassals and offer tribute to the Ming emperor. The first fleet departed in 1405. It consisted of 317 ships and 27,000 people, including sailors, soldiers, scholars, craftspeople, and fortune-tellers. It rode the monsoon winds from the coast of Fujian in southeast China to the kingdom of Champa in southern Vietnam, where the crew traded silks and porcelain for lacquer wood, rhinoceros horn, and elephant ivory. The ships then visited Aceh, Majapahit, and several other city-states in Indonesia, where many Chinese merchants lived. From there, they moved on to Sri Lanka and Calicut. In Calicut, the crew traded for pearls, peppers, gems, and coral. On the return leg, Zheng He brought diplomats from the states he had visited to meet the emperor. On later voyages, the ships visited Persia, Arabia, and East Africa, and on one return trip, a ship carried a giraffe as a gift for the Ming emperor, figure 2.20. Painting A shows a man leading a giraffe with a rope tied around the giraffe's head. Text appears above the giraffe. Woodblock print B shows 4 Chinese ships at sea. Figure 2.20, the voyages of Zheng He. Originally sent from the Somali Ajuran Empire in Africa. A. The giraffe shown in this copy of a 15th century painting was later given to the Yongle Emperor by the Sultan of Bengal. Zheng He's historic fleet B, which carried such treasures back to China, is depicted in a Chinese woodblock print of the early 17th century. Credit, a modification of work, Chen Zhang's painting of a giraffe and its attendant by China National Museum/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit B, modification of work, Chinese woodblock print, representing Zheng He's ships by unknown/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. In 1430, the Xuan Emperor, the Yongle Emperor's grandson, ordered Zheng He to undertake his 7th and final voyage. These forays were China's last significant effort to make contact with overseas lands for many decades, however. Factions at court worried about the effect of outsiders and their ideas on the empire, as well as the cost of the trips. Following Zheng He's death, his charts and records were destroyed, and the ships of the fleet were left to rot. China continued to interest itself in the affairs of territories it bordered, however. In 1406–1407, China invaded Vietnam to restore the Tran Emperor to his throne after it had been usurped. A Vietnamese revolt ended China's occupation of the country in 1427. The victorious Lair dynasty then pledged loyalty to China as a vassal state. In 1449, a Chinese military expedition into Mongol territory ended in the slaughter of the Chinese at the Battle of Tumu. In 1592 and 1597, Ming armies helped Korean troops repel a Japanese invasion. At other times, though, the Ming attempted to avoid conflict whenever possible. After the 1449 defeat of the Chinese by Western Mongols, known as the Warat, at the Battle of Tumu, construction began on a new Great Wall to supplement the original Great Wall, the earthen fortifications erected by the Qin in the 3rd century BCE. It was hoped that the new fortification would protect China from the outside world. China needed money to pay for this massive project, however, as well as such other projects as the extension of the Grand Canal to Beijing, which the Yongle Emperor had made his capital, and the building of a massive complex of palaces and imperial offices in Beijing known as the Forbidden City. In 1567, the Ming dynasty reversed the policy that had prohibited foreign trade, and soon European merchant ships began arriving again. In 1577, Portuguese merchants, who had already been trading in China in violation of the law, were given permission to establish a factory at Macau. Of even greater interest to the Chinese, though, were Spanish galleons from Manila, carrying silver from mines in the Americas. When they left China, these ships took with them Chinese silks, satins, taffetas, velvets, damasks, and brocades, as well as ready-made clothing. One ship carried 50,000 pairs of silk stockings. The Spanish also carried out the blue and white Chinese porcelain that had become the rage in Europe, along with ginger, cotton cloth, pearls, musk, saltpeter to make gunpowder, sapphires, rubies, and cages of songbirds along with other exotic goods. China's economy boomed, and many Chinese peasants began to focus on producing goods for the foreign market. Some specialized in raising cotton and weaving cotton textiles. Others raised mulberry trees and harvested their leaves to sell to families that raised silkworms, which feed on the leaves. Peasants who specialized in the raising of silkworms in turn sold their cocoons to others, who boiled them to kill the larvae and unreeled them to make silk thread. This thread was sold to households that wove silk cloth, which might then be passed on to those who specialized in embroidery. In Jingdezhen in Jiangxi province, people mass-produced porcelain. As the Ming economy grew, so too did its population. Crops from the Americas such as sweet potatoes and maize were adopted by many peasants, especially those who lived in hilly, dry regions like Sichuan. These crops grew well and provided abundant calories for farm families. Hot and sweet peppers from the Americas were added to regional cuisines, transforming them, and peanuts added not only variety but an important source of fat in diets lacking meat. These new crops ultimately proved harmful, however. As hillsides were cleared to plant corn, for example, regions became deforested and lost their valuable topsoil. Population growth was also not accompanied by an increase in cultivated land sufficient to support the added numbers of people. And in many regions, farmers found themselves tilling smaller fields as the generations passed. New wealth led many commoners to imitate the nobility, building large homes with courtyards and gardens, purchasing fine rosewood furniture, collecting art and antiques, and hiring tutors to educate their children and prepare their sons for the examinations that would earn them jobs in the imperial bureaucracy. Restaurants, inns, and taverns sprang up in market towns and cities across the country as people became able to afford leisure activities. A flourishing printing industry produced not only agricultural manuals and copies of the Confucian classics, but also plays and novels, some with erotic scenes and storylines. Guidebooks advised people traveling on business about where to stay and eat, and also provided information about sites of historical interest. Increasingly, people began to travel for pleasure as well. In the cities, prostitution boomed, and at the very top of a complex hierarchy, courtesans hired themselves out to wealthy merchants to entertain male guests at parties by playing music or competing with them in poetry contests. Not all members of Ming society were pleased by the changes taking place in China. The burst of commercial activity made many prosperous, but not everyone benefited. As income disparities grew, resentments did as well. Members of noble families were appalled by the fact that many commoners could now dress and live as they did. Greater opportunities for commoners and changes in the structure of society were reflected even in the interpretation of the teachings of Confucius. Zhu Zai, a Confucian scholar of the southern Song dynasty whose works were influential at the beginning of the Ming dynasty, had agreed with Confucius that all people possessed the ability to lead moral lives, but he believed this inner morality could become evident only through a process of intensive education. In the middle of the Ming dynasty, however, the scholar Wang Yangming rejected Zhu Zai's teachings. According to Wang, morality was intuitive, and people could cultivate their moral natures while still participating in the mundane affairs of everyday life. Even the uneducated could understand moral truths. Other writers of the Ming era criticized the traditional structure of the family, which Confucius had considered the basis of an orderly society, and preached that it was not necessary to conform to what society considered proper modes of behavior. These doctrines frightened the more conservative members of society. Dueling voices. Proper behavior for women. In East Asia in the 16th and 17th centuries, public concern for the morals of a rapidly changing society was reflected in a focus on women's behavior. Chinese and Japanese scholars wrote works admonishing elite women about how to behave so as to protect their reputations and those of their families. Following are excerpts from treatises of advice for women from both of these countries, the first from China and the second from Japan. With the decline of education today, women in the inner quarters have really ceased to be governed by rights and laws. Those born in villages are accustomed to hearing coarse words, and those born in rich households have loose, proud, and extravagant natures. Their heads are covered with gold and pearls, and their entire bodies with fine silks. They affect lightheartedness in behavior and cleverness in speech, but they mouth no beneficial words and perform no good deeds. At the high end are those women who wield their writing brushes and aspire to develop their talents in poetry so as to brag that they are superb scholars. At the low end are those who strum vulgar tunes on their stringed instruments and sing lascivious words, almost like prostitutes. Lu Kun, models for the inner quarters. A woman must always be on the alert and keep a strict watch over her own conduct. In the morning, she must rise early and at night go late to rest. Instead of sleeping in the middle of the day, she must be intent on the duties of her household. She must not grow tired of weaving, sewing, and spinning. She must not drink too much tea and wine, nor must she feed her eyes and ears on theatrical performances, ditties, and ballads. In her capacity as a wife, she must keep her husband's household in proper order. If the wife is evil and profligate, the house will be ruined. In everything she must avoid extravagance, and in regard to both food and clothes, she must act according to her station in life and never give in to luxury and pride. Kaibara Ekin, the great learning for women. What kinds of behavior were these writers trying to encourage in women? Why were these behaviors important? What evidence do you see in these excerpts that women's lives had been affected by what we would call consumer culture? Where do you see evidence of women's freedom? Where do you see the influence of Confucian values? The days of the Ming were numbered. In the early 17th century, the onset of one of the intervals of the Little Ice Age, a period of cooling in the northern hemisphere, brought low temperatures and droughts in many parts of the country, leading to famine in some areas. Floods devastated other regions. Farmers whose crops had failed or who had inherited plots of land too small to support their families were unable to pay their taxes or their rents. Even those who could pay had difficulty finding the silver with which the law said taxes must be paid. The government needed silver more than ever. The cost of supporting the imperial family had grown astronomically. Over the years, court officials had used their positions to amass great wealth, often through corruption, and the war in Korea had been tremendously costly. With silver in short supply, the emperor sent court officials to the provinces, supposedly to inspect mines. In reality, the job of the officials was to confiscate silver held by merchants. When a group of Chinese officials arrived in Manila in 1603 to take silver from Chinese merchants there, the Spanish, believing China was planning to attack the city, killed 20,000 Chinese residents and were no longer willing to trade with China. With the imperial government lacking sufficient funds to pay the army, Chinese soldiers were laid off. In 1627, 1628, hungry, impoverished, and angry soldiers and peasants rose up in revolt in northern China. By 1632, violence had spread to other provinces. This made it even harder for government officials to collect taxes, which Beijing had raised in 1639, angering people even more. North of the Yellow River, discontented peasants formed an army led by Li Zicheng. In the area between the Yellow and Yangtze rivers, other rebels were led by Zhang Xianzhang. Province after province erupted in violence. In April 1644, Li Zicheng's peasant army seized Beijing. In desperation, the last Ming emperor hanged himself in the palace garden after killing most of his family. Li declared himself the ruler of China and the founder of a new dynasty. He did not rule long enough to establish his dynasty, however. The next rulers of China were the Manchus. The Manchus were members of an ethnic group that lived northeast of the Great Wall in southern Manchuria. They were descended from Jurchen pastoralists who had established the Jin dynasty that ruled northern China from 1115 to 1234, until their defeat by the Mongols. The Manchus had then settled down and become farmers. In the late 16th century, the Manchu leader Narhasai formed the Manchu tribes into a state that paid tribute to the Ming emperor. In 1616, as the Ming dynasty began to collapse, the Manchus attacked Chinese settlements on the Liaodong Peninsula. They forced artisans to provide weapons for their army and farmers to provide food. Officials and army officers who were willing to submit to them were given positions in the Manchu administration. Those who rebelled were massacred. Following Narhasai's death in 1626, his son Hong Taiji proclaimed himself the leader of the Qing, pure, clear, dynasty. As he expanded Manchu control over Chinese territory, he adopted Chinese forms of administration and incorporated greater numbers of Chinese officials in his government. Chinese bureaucrats and army officers, disgusted with the corruption of the Ming government and its inability to respond to the country's problems, began to defect to the Manchus in large numbers. Fearing ongoing chaos following Li Zicheng's capture of Beijing, Ming General Wu Sangui, who was charged with guarding the eastern end of the Great Wall, allowed the Manchu armies through. On May 27, 1644, Wu Sangui's troops and Manchu forces defeated Li Zicheng's army and took control of Beijing. The Manchu armies swept south, but Ming resistance there was fierce, and it was not until 1683 that all of China was brought under Manchu control. Despite what many Chinese had feared, the early Qing emperors proved good rulers. They strove to preserve their identity as Manchus, but they also embraced Chinese culture. The first Qing emperor, Kangxi, toured China to acquaint himself with his new domain. He adopted the Chinese bureaucratic apparatus and ordered that each of the government's 6 major ministries be led by Manchu and Han Chinese co-administrators. Kangxi governed according to Confucian principles and maintained the system of imperial examinations for government jobs. The Manchu were careful to maintain their superior positions, however, and demanded loyalty from the Chinese. For example, local positions in government were usually given to Han Chinese bureaucrats, but supervisory positions were given to Manchus. All males were also required to demonstrate their acceptance of Manchu rule by wearing the distinctive Manchu hairstyle. The front part of the head was shaved, and the hair in the back was grown long and braided into a single queue. After 1645, men who did not wear their hair in this fashion were subject to execution. Link to learning. Read about the tour Kangxi took through China to learn about his empire. Click on the links on the page to see the painted scrolls that were made to depict the regions he visited. Like other Chinese rulers, Kangxi also supported Buddhism. He tolerated other religions, including Christianity, which was permitted so long as Chinese Christians continued to be filial sons and daughters who venerated their ancestors, a practice the Jesuits supported. The Jesuits' efforts to learn the Chinese language and their respect for Chinese culture made them more successful at winning converts than the Dominicans and Franciscans. But members of these other orders grew jealous and complained to the Pope about the Jesuits' willingness to accommodate Chinese practices. When the Vatican ruled that all church services must be conducted in Latin and that Chinese Christians must be ordered to abandon their ancestral rites, Kangxi decreed that missionaries who complied would have to leave China. Kangxi and his successors, Yangzheng and Qianlong, attempted to redress the problems that had seemed to lead to the downfall of the Ming. They placed China on secure financial footing, and fearing that the Ming had succumbed to lax moral standards brought on by wealth and luxury, Qing scholars returned to the teachings of Zhu Zai. Morally suspect plays and novels were banned, and great emphasis was placed on traditional Confucian values. For example, Qianlong visited his mother every day to display his devotion to her, figure 221. Female chastity was encouraged, and so many memorial arches were erected by communities to commemorate chaste widows, women who had refused to remarry after the death of their husbands, that the government attempted to bring an end to the practice in the 19th century by declaring that only women who committed suicide upon becoming widows could be so memorialized. This painting shows Emperor Qianlong. The emperor wears long robes and a hat. He sits at a table with paper and ink nearby. He holds a paintbrush in his right hand and strokes his long beard with his left hand. Figure 2. 21 Emperor Qianlong. Although he was a Manchu, Emperor Qianlong embraced Confucian values and tried to live the life of a Confucian scholar. Every day he spent hours working on affairs of state, visited his mother, and then dedicated himself to writing poetry and admiring works of art. This 18th-century painting of him in his study was made by Giuseppe Castiglione, an Italian Jesuit at Qianlong's court. Credit: Qianlong and His Studies by Chiume Ho/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. The Qing, however, continued the Ming policy of interacting with other countries as little as possible. Like the Ming, they did intervene in Asia where it seemed their interests were at stake. For example, in 1683, the island of Taiwan, a base for pirates and a refuge for fleeing Ming loyalists, was made part of China. In 1720, Qing armies took control of the city of Lhasa, the capital of Tibet. In the 1750s, they fought Mongols and Uyghurs in Central Asia and incorporated the province of Xinjiang, New Province, into China. During the Qing dynasty, China continued to rely on foreign trade income, and European demand for Chinese products did not cease. The Qing remained wary of Europeans, however, and wished to minimize contact with foreigners as the Japanese had done. Non-Chinese were allowed to reside in Macau, but after 1759 they could conduct trade only through the port of Guangzhou and trade only with the Kohong, the official Chinese merchant guild. While in the city on business, they had to stay in a special quarter for Europeans. When they had finished their transactions, they had to depart. In the eyes of the Chinese, Europe was an inferior place that possessed nothing of interest. Although European scientific knowledge was impressive to some, most Chinese merchants and officials maintained a disdainful attitude toward the West that was reflected in the way in which Qianlong received Lord George Macartney, who visited China in 1793 on behalf of the British king. Qianlong demanded that Macartney, as the representative of an inferior monarch, demonstrate his respect by kneeling and knocking his head on the ground, the traditional way in which vassals greeted the emperor. Macartney refused to do so, and Qianlong announced that he was willing to accept the British monarch as a vassal, but did not consider him an equal. He also refused Britain's request to establish a permanent embassy in China. China, he noted, already had everything it needed, and Britain had nothing of value to offer. Korea and its neighbors. After the fall of the Mongols in China, Koreans were divided regarding the nature of their relationship with the Ming dynasty. In the 1380s, Yi Xiangjai and his fellow General Cho Yong won fame for themselves when they defeated Japanese pirates who were raiding Korea. When the Ming dynasty attempted to annex Korean territory, Cho Yong declared himself in opposition to the Ming and advised an invasion of China's Liaodong Peninsula. Yi Xiangjai was chosen to lead the army, but instead took the opportunity to seize Korea's capital and gain control of the government in 1388. In 1392, after ruling for 4 years through puppet kings, Yi Xiangjai proclaimed himself the head of a new dynasty, the Joseon, named for an earlier Korean dynasty. Ruling as King Taejo, he declared himself a vassal of the far more powerful Ming dynasty and established friendly relations with China. Taejo embraced Confucian principles, which, unlike Buddhism, focus on the maintenance of the family and of social hierarchies instead of the well-being of the individual. Korean society was divided into rigidly defined classes. At the top was a ruling class of civil bureaucrats and military officials called the Yongbin, who ruled the country along with the king. Membership in this class depended on doing well on the imperial exams, which were based on knowledge of the Confucian classics, like similar exams in China. As in China, wealthy families and nobility of the former dynasty dominated the exams, because only the men in these families had the time and money to acquire the education necessary to do well. Membership in a Yongbin family also conferred the right to serve on local ruling councils, and thus control their affairs. Eventually, membership in the Yongbin became hereditary when only the sons of these families were allowed to take the imperial exams. The Yongbin were supported by the labor of the Sangmin, indentured servants who worked the land. Unlike the Yongbin, the Xianbai were scholarly, highly educated men who devoted themselves to lives of study and served the public without financial reward. They did not covet riches and preferred scholarly pursuits, believing their role was to serve as moral exemplars for the rest of society. They valued integrity above all else, and served as advocates of the common people, even if that meant risking the displeasure of the king. Even though they came from the same class as the Yongbin, their lack of interest in attaining wealth and power set them apart. The love of study and learning that characterized the Xianbai flourished in the reign of King Sejong, the fourth king of Korea. In 1442, Korean scholars developed a device to accurately gauge rainfall. Scholars also developed a means of measuring the direction and velocity of the wind. An astronomical observatory was constructed, and a variety of sundials and water clocks were invented to measure time. Figure 222. Triangulation devices and surveying rods were used to measure the elevation of land. Sejong recruited scholars from the institution of research he had founded, known as the Hall of Worthies, to help him develop Hangul, an alphabet that could capture the sounds of Korean speech. Hangul, which Sejong introduced in 1446, was intended to be used by common people, instead of the Chinese characters with which the elite Yongbin wrote. This photograph shows a black celestial globe on display in a museum. Visitors to the museum and other exhibits are visible in the background. Figure 2. 22. A map of the heavens. This 15th century celestial globe, used to make astronomical observations, was invented by Jang Yong-sil during the reign of Korea's King Sejong. Credit: Korean Armillary Sphere by Wikimachine/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. After the reign of Sejong, the Joseon dynasty encountered numerous difficulties. In 1592 and again in 1597, Japan invaded Korea. In the following century, the Manchus attacked Korea several times between 1627 and 1636. In addition to problems caused by attacks from without, great division was created by fights between factions of the Yongbin class. These factions, the Easterners and the Westerners, engaged in violent conflict that persisted from generation to generation. Beginning in the late 17th century, disgust at the conflict among the Yongbin elites led many scholars, officials, and common people to support the Silhak movement, which promoted the study of the physical sciences and technology in order to solve practical problems instead of focusing narrowly on the Confucian classics. Silhak means practical learning. Silhak proponents also advocated numerous social reforms, including land reform and revision of Korea's rigid social structure. These reformers argued that learning should promote the welfare of the people. They stressed social equality and the importance of Korean culture. Concern for the preservation of Korean culture was undoubtedly influenced by Korea's relationship to the countries that surrounded it. Buddhism and Confucianism, the philosophy on which the Joseon dynasty was based, were both introduced by the Chinese. Korean writing, painting, architecture, and pottery were also influenced by China. For centuries, Korean scholars wrote with Chinese characters. Over the centuries, Korea had been invaded by Chinese, Khitans, Mongols, Japanese, and Manchus. Nevertheless, the constant influx of foreign ideas and material goods helped to reinforce in Koreans the separate sense of a distinctive Korean identity. Trying to differentiate themselves from Chinese, Mongols, and Japanese, Koreans like the Silhak reformers emphasized the importance of maintaining a Korean identity based on Korean history and culture.